Hello, and welcome to this week's Insider Insights. My name is Mariana Siciliano, and I'm an educator in public programs and creative practice at the Met. And I'm joined today by my colleagues Griff Mann, Andrea Acci, and Yael Biro. This program is a part of an ongoing series that provides a closer look at the Met's collection and exhibitions through conversations with museum experts. And we hope you'll continue to join us as we release more talks each week. In honor of the Met's 150th anniversary this week, we wanted to focus our time together today on a new series of installations in the museum called Crossroads, which examines aspects of cultural interconnectedness and are comprised mainly of objects from the Met collection. Today we'll be looking specifically at the installation called Power and Piety, located in our galleries for medieval art. We'll begin with a brief overview on the installation from Griffith Mann, the Michel David Weil curator in charge of medieval art in the Cloisters. Then we'll take a closer look at a pair of objects with Andrea Acci, assistant curator, medieval art, and Yael Biro, associate curator in the arts of Africa, Oceania, and the Americas. Griff, I'll turn things over to you. Thank you for getting us started with an overview.
Thanks so much, Mariana, and thank you for all of you out there that are joining us for this program. It's a pleasure to be able to share our collections and installations and exhibitions with you while we are closed, and we hope you are all staying safe and well. I'm going to share my screen so I can give you a sense of what is featured in this installation. So just give me a moment to find my presentation. Okay, there it is. So as Mariana mentioned, Crossroads is one of three installations, or comprises three installations in different parts of the building, and Power and Piety, which opened on March 5th with the other installations, is in the Medieval Sculpture Hall. This is the Medieval Sculpture Hall as you probably remember it, but one of the things I just wanted to do is to share with people where we are in the building so that you have a sense of what a crossroads this space really is in the main museum. Met 5th, the Medieval Sculpture Hall, is really in the kind of very heart of the museum's building. If you're walking north-south across the campus, you have to pass through these galleries. And if you're walking from Fifth Avenue back towards the Lehman Wing, you walk right through these galleries. So these really are one of the major crossroads within the museum. And it's a perfect opportunity to bring together works of art from across the collections to show them together in one space. So in this aerial view, you get a sense of the installation itself. It's two platforms, one at the west end and one at the east end of the building. And then in the middle are three freestanding pedestals. So we have 12 works of art, which are drawn from across the museum. 6 different curatorial departments contributed works of art to this installation. And the time frame that it encompasses is the time frame that we think about when we think about the European Middle Ages. So beginning, say, at the end of the early part of the 4th century AD, going up as far as the early 16th century. And I'm going to give you a very short introduction to the installation itself, and then we're going to spend some time talking at length, or at greater length at any rate, about 2 works of art that are paired together in the gallery. So the first grouping is really focused on monumental sculpture that deals with the concept of divine authority. These are all objects that were made in stone and are quite large and would have been installed in public spaces like civic squares, plazas, royal precincts, temples, and even churches. One of the nice things about these kinds of pairings is that we can actually bring together works of art that might have been made in different parts of the world, but were actually made at roughly the same time period. This is a great example of a European sculpture on the left, the Virgin and Child, that was produced, we know exactly when this was made, in 1345, right on the cusp of the Black Death. And then a figure of the Guanyin, this bodhisattva of compassion, the sun moon bodhisattva figure that was made just 40 years later. We know exactly when this one was made. It was made in 1385. So one in wood, one in marble, both sculptures dealing with this concept of kind of compassionate divinities. A second grouping focuses on sacred aura, so objects that were made to serve not only as sculptures, but also as containers, as repositories, kind of power objects that were invested with additional powers through the sacred contents that were placed within them in little compartments. And then pious patrons focuses on objects for which we have documented or documents that exist either in images or in other ways that talk about patrons and the individuals that would have commissioned these objects. In two cases here, the objects were made by female religious communities or women. So the role of women as producers and consumers of art in the early modern period is something that's highlighted in Power and Piety as well. One of the most interesting juxtapositions is this one, and this is a pairing of a work of art that was made in Western Europe, as you'll hear in a moment, in the 15th century, together with one that comes from the Dogon culture of present-day Mali. And I'm joined by two of my colleagues who can speak at greater length about these two objects, Andrea Aci and Yael Biro. And I will turn over the presentation to Andrea, my co-curator on the project.
So venerated intermediaries consist of two wood figures, which embody similar responses to devotion and prayer, but are strikingly different in appearance. One figure, the Dogon man, is from West Africa, and as Griff said, it's carbon dated between the 14th to 17th century. And the second is of the African Magus, which was carved in Germany by 1489. Artists carved these pieces for shrines that were a focal point of prayer and veneration for the communities. Here in the Crossroads installation, both sculptures are out of the museum context. So the African figure is on loan from the Department of the Arts of Africa's Oceania and the Americas, and the medieval figure joins him from the Cloisters. Together, they present two powerful depictions of Africans from the pre-modern era. And I'll focus on the medieval figure here. So in this black and white installation photograph from 1957, the kings join a seated virgin and child in a manner similar to their original context, which was a German church. The photograph is from a Cloisters exhibition featuring the three kings or three magi, and the group originally formed the central shrine of a large altarpiece. Today, the virgin and child are still in the convent for which the altar was made. The story of the three kings and the virgin and child is well known in Christian communities. The New Testament account tells of wise men offering gifts to the infant Jesus, but it gives neither the number of individuals nor the ethnicities of these kings or magi. At least one of the king is from Sheba, which was associated with Ethiopia, so that's where we get the black king or black magi. Our African Magus is carved out of maple, and he's adorned in paint and gold. And the carving's really intricate. You can see on the, his rosette brooch on his neck, and then the carvings on the sleeves. He's about 5 feet tall. He weighs 65 pounds. On his head is a crown, and the crown's underneath this wrapped cloth material that has been interpreted as a turban. The crown flattens his curls and allows his ringlets to fall near his ears. And this is really interesting to me because this is the way that African hair or black hair acts when something's such as a headband is on. And so it shows that the artist was familiar with Africans and their features. His elegant pose and contemporary attire are reminiscent of a medieval royal courtier. And the broad drapery patterns, such as the patterns on his arms, they're characteristics of late Gothic sculpture in the region. He's holding a cup, he's opening a cup that are similar to vessels that are made in the same region from the same period. So the artist is using clothes and objects and materials that are contemporary in order to depict these New Testament figures. So when he's installed at the Cloisters with his companion, the two other magi, it's usually a little bit above eye level. So you can't see these details and the features I'm describing. And one really lovely thing about the Crossroads installations is that we can see the backs. You can see the details of the carvings and how the fabric resting on his arm falls to the ground in one piece, providing physical support for the structure. You can also see the areas in the back that are not painted. you know, they didn't need to be because it was originally against the wall, but these are interesting things for the art historian and the visitors to see, to think about the materials and the making of art in the medieval period. I love the fact that we can see the holes in his back, his head going along the back, so thinking about the way that the structure was originally installed. And also the rough carving marks. You can basically see the hands of the artist here. So, as we mentioned, I mean, all of these artworks in Crossroads are out of context, the museum context, but we are able to create new context and look carefully and consider these remarkable objects in ways that we haven't before in their installations in the museum. So I'm going to turn this over to Yao so she can talk about the second figure in the pairing.
Thank you, Andrea, and hello, everybody. I will now be telling you a little bit about the other sculpture in that pairing, which was created by a Dogon artist, probably in the between the 14th and the 17th century, which is what the carbon dating is telling us. And it was created in a region of West Africa that is present-day Mali, more specifically central Mali, and in a region known as the Bandiagara escarpment, which is characterized by its very dramatic landscape and dramatic cliffs. So this sculpture is about life-size, and in that sense, it's almost the same scale as the African King that Andrea just presented. And it's really quite an unusual scale for works created by Dogon artists. We only know a few other examples of such monumental sculptures. And it represents an elder or a leader, and we see that with that very detailed beard that frames his face, the cap that he's wearing on his head, the bracelets and armlets that decorate his arms, and also this whole row of amulets that are around his neck. As you can see, it's very physical. It really emanates sheer physicality. It's this very muscular representation, and it's also a very vertical representation, which really gives it this very strong presence. And one thing that I find really interesting, and you can see this in these different views of that sculpture, you can see it from every angle, is how much you feel the shape of the wood, you know, that trunk of wood from which it would have been carved, which gives it also this verticality, of course. So that type of sculpture would have been positioned on an altar for an entire community and would have worked as an intercessor between the people and the spiritual realm. In that region, which is known for being very arid, very dry, rain was of course very precious and was there as the primary, what was of course primarily needed for new life and for sustenance. And so as a result, a lot of these altar sculptures might have acted as intercessors in favor of rain in order to get rain. And this is what we understand now today as this gesture of the arms raised, which is something that you find quite often in sculptures created by Dogon artists or their predecessors, Tintam artists in that particular region. With this gesture, the figure is really there as this status of intermediary is physically embodied in the carving, where the arms raised create that link between earth and the other realm, the spiritual realm. As I was saying, this Dogon of the Bandiagara escarpment is very arid, and it is, I'm showing you here an image of some of these caves that were carved out of the sheer rock of these cliffs. And in these caves were used as funerary sites, but also as places where the sculptures, when they were no longer used within their communities, where they would have been deposited. As a result, we actually know quite, as a result, what I meant to say is that sculptures survive, which is not so often the case, you know, for sculptures from West Africa, where usually the humid climate just does not allow for wood to survive. So it is quite rare to have sculptures that date so far back to the 14th to the 17th century, as is the case for that particular sculpture. And one thing that I want to point out again is how this the very surface of the sculpture bears the trace of this very long life. And I think in the detail, you can see how worn the wood is. And not only is it partly broken, as you can see with the missing arm and the missing feet, but also traces of burn, really just a sculpture that had a very long life within its community and after. And now I will pass the mic again to Griff, and I will stop sharing.
Yale and Andrea, thank you so much for taking some time to talk with us about that pairing. I think that's actually one of the more interesting groupings in this installation. I am just curious to know, I mean, we're all trained as specialists and work within specific collection areas of the museum. I'm just curious to know what it's like for you to see objects taken from different cultures and different, well, in this case, maybe not so different time periods, but nevertheless from different departments within the museum and brought together in permanent collection installations. What's it like to think that way and to work that way? Andrea, you want to unmute?
Sorry. For me, it was a hard project because, you know, we're a specialist in medieval art, and we were kind of looking at the time period, the global Middle Ages, and thinking about works of art that were made between the 4th and 15th century. But, you know, I'm aware of what's going on in the world of that period, but I'm not a specialist in Asian art or African art. And so it really pushed us to work with colleagues and think about the artworks and art making in a different way that I wasn't necessarily trained to think about. And so it was a difficult project, but it was really rewarding. I remember when we were doing the installation and different colleagues was coming in and we were talking about different pairings, and I wouldn't have had this opportunity, I think, without Crossroads, to talk with different colleagues who are working on objects from the same time period and thinking about cross-cultural connections and similarities and differences. I think it was also a very humbling experience as well, because we were able to take an interpretation. And I think that this project allowed us to be vulnerable in our work. And so I felt it was really rewarding. What did you think, because when we approached your department with not only this African pairing, but then also with the Mayan god, it probably was an unusual request.
Yeah, I mean, usually this sculpture of a Dogon man with raised arms is usually positioned right at the entrance of the galleries. So the idea of having it leave, that very central place in the African galleries where it really greets the audience when they arrive in the Michael C. Rockefeller wing, it was at first, a little bit scary to let it go, I guess. But the way our collection arrived at the museum, the collection of the arts of Africa, Oceania, and the Americas in the early 80s, it was really positioned at one end of the building because of the architecture of that building and no other reason. There wasn't necessarily any deep thoughts about where it was going to be positioned, next to which department, and how did these departments interact with each other. So I think an exhibition like Crossroads, a project like Crossroads, really allows to rethink the position, the place of these collections within the museum at large, have a true art historical discussion about these interactions, which is something that we can't do in our permanent gallery on a day-to-day basis. So, looking at a specific period like you did here, or thinking about geography in a different way, about these histories of global encounters, really, it just, I think, allows a lot of possibilities from an art historical perspective. And I think it's also exciting for the audience, for the public, to discover these connections that they might never have thought about.
Yeah, one of the things I think that is interesting for our general visitors is to have a chance to get a sense of the encyclopedic character of the collections in one glance, so to speak. One of the challenges of this kind of work is that, these objects are already removed from their original context, but at least within the permanent collection gallery spaces, you have other objects from these cultures that help to provide a little bit more of a grounding for people. How do you feel about the kind of the the way in which these objects are brought together. In this particular instance, these are two works of art that were produced at a moment when Africa and Europe were really engaging in a much more protracted and extended period of interaction. Are there things that you hope people might take away or become curious about as a result of this kind of combination of objects?
Yeah, one thing that was really interesting about this pairing is really during this moment in the medieval period, 15th century, when Western Europeans started being in contact with West Africa through diplomatic exchange and trade routes. Obviously, Western Europe was in contact with Africa since antiquity, but it was this moment that was an increased contact. And in this moment, we start seeing Africans represented in medieval art through the three magi. For hundreds of years, a representation of the magi were just basically the same ethnicities. And it's interesting that the medieval interpretation of the New Testament text changes during this period, and they start representing one of the magi as being from Africa. And so, one of the new things I learned about our medieval African king is that we don't really know what his name is, because originally we title him as Casper, but then through our research we recognized while in Germany it might be Casper, at the same time it was titled as Balthazar in Italy. And I realized that a lot of these interpretations were modern interpretations, and it's not necessarily clear what the medieval artist would have thought the name of the object was. He just represented him as African king. So yeah, you were just working on the Sahel show, which also talks about this period. Have you been thinking about these connections between Western Africa and medieval Europe? Your show focused so much on the Western African moment.
Yeah, so it's true. The exhibition Sahel Art and Empires on the Shores of the Sahara, which is curated by Alice Lagama, and I helped working on this for the past 4 years, is looking at that moment, at all these empires that succeed to one another from the 3rd century to the 19th century in that region of West Africa called the Sahel. And, the 15th century is a really critical moment, both in West Africa and I think in the moment of connection and relationship between West Africa and Europe. So in that sense, I find that pairing really interesting, because in the 15th century, in the Sahel, it is the apogee of the Empire of Mali. We also see the Songhai Empire disappear during that period. It's a moment of huge movements in the Sahel, and changes of paradigms and changes of power, and important migrations happening. I mean, it's a critical moment in the Sahel's history. And at the same time, we see the entire geography of the connection between the Sahel and Europe change. While it used to be, through that trans-Saharan trade where all these the trade was happening in connection, through North Africa all the way to Europe. By the beginning of the 15th century, you see the Portuguese arrive along the shore, and the circumnavigation of that coast is happening. So the 15th century, for that reason, is just such a critical moment. And the fact that both sculptures might have been created around that time, I find really striking, because on one end it shows how a hypothetical African might have been, envisioned in Europe in a moment when very few Africans might have been seen in Europe, actually, and through the sculpture from your collection. And on the other, we have this representation done by a carver from the region of an elder, even though it's not a direct portrait, it's more of an idealized representation. It's just such different ways of thinking about African sculpture, representation of Africans in the world at that particular moment, from an African perspective, from a European perspective. And it just, I think, raised so many questions that I hope the visitor will engage with I think, kind of in a natural way, just by seeing these two sculptures next to each other.
I think that's one of the things that we really hope this installation does for people, is open up questions and inspires some curiosity. The other nice thing about the installation in the building itself is that this sculpture is at the end of the gallery that allows people access eventually to the AAOA galleries themselves. So there is a little bit of wayfinding here that happens as well. I want to just take a moment to thank both of you for preparing these short presentations for us and for participating in the Crossroads conversation, and I'll pass it back to Mariana.
Your microphone.
Of course. Thank you to the three of you for sharing your expertise and your insights on not only the installation, but for giving us a closer look at these two objects specifically and in a greater context. And here I see you're showing some online resources where we can continue to investigate and explore some of the other objects that are in the installation. Thank you to the three of you, and thank you for joining us, and hope to see you next week.
Thank you.